Now, in this recording, I'm going to talk about Bonaventure's Journey of the Mind to God, steps 3 and 4, which correspond to chapter 3 and 4 in his short work, The Journey of the Mind to God. Now, step 3 is entitled The Consideration of God Through His Image Imprinted on Our Natural Powers. And step 4 is The Consideration of God in His Image Reformed Through the Gifts of Grace. Okay, so step 3 is at this stage, we have seen how the first two steps of the ascent to God, and the first two steps had to do with the external world, which is that you contemplate the external world as a vestige, right? And you see the external world as a signpost, right? Something that tells you about something else. And also, when you begin to examine the external world and you look at its structure and its beauty and its order, you're exposed to some of these eternal truths like math, and you begin to get a sense of a deeper meaning behind things. Okay, you begin to, and that sort of leads you to God in some way. All right, so steps 1 and 2 had to do very much with the physical senses and learn to discipline them and teach your senses to see things as they are. Now, step 3 and 4 are now taking out a slightly different approach. So I had said that in step 1 and 2, there was, so let's see, I'm just going to draw a stick figure here. See if this works out. All right, so that's you, me, us, right? And what we do in steps 1 and 2 is we're looking out into the world, okay? And we're trying to learn about God that way. And then the next two steps, so step 3 and 4, had to do with this introspection. That means we're going inside ourselves now. That's the next two steps. And then after these two steps, 4 and 5 now begin to go up, because that's where God is. Okay, so to go up, you have to go in, right? That's the way the ascent works. All right, so let's think about, let's see what's going on with step 3. So the first thing we note is that in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, okay, the Bible says that humans are made in the image of God. All right, so that's an important statement. That means that somehow when you look at human beings, you're looking at something that looks like God, right? So like when you look at your reflection in the mirror, right, to some degree, that's an image of you. An image could be anything, right? An image is some sort of representation of you. So what does it mean that human beings are made in the image of God? So this is one of those tricky things that theologians have wrestled with for centuries. All right, so medieval theologians, who Bonaventure is, they tended to look at the image of God as, so let me put it this way, the part of the human person that most reflected God was the mind, right, or the soul. Okay, so that's so the human body itself. So the body in some way could represent God, but they tended to dismiss the body as the image of God, right? It was the mind or the soul, right? There's used interchangeably here, that were the image of God. And so once you begin to reflect on the mind, you consider God in terms of considering the mind, you are looking at the image of God, and that's what makes this step very important. Okay, so in the first two steps, we looked at looked for God through vestiges. That's this leftover, this remnant, which are the created things in the world. They're echoes of God. Now, in steps 3 and 4, you're not looking at an actual image of God, right? And that way, you're getting a better sense of what God is like. And it's in this step that you begin to develop your spiritual senses, so you can actually begin to look at God and see what God is like. in himself. All right, so because we're made in the image of God, now when you examine the soul, you are examining the image of God, right? So he goes and says, well, he goes ahead and looks at the soul. And when you reflect on the soul, he says the first thing you see, or let's say the most fundamental thing, is that the soul loves itself. Okay, so the fact that the soul loves itself is sort of an interesting one, and it's sort of the basis of um, a lot of medieval theology, right? And even in theology today, it's still very much an important thing. Okay, so when we look at the soul and say that it loves itself, and this is the most fundamental thing about the soul, right? This is the most necessary thing about the soul. Then this fact that soul loves itself, what does that tell us about the soul? So, in viewing the soul's love for itself, we see three things, right? And so the three things here that are revealed when we see the soul's love for itself are memory, intellect, and will. Okay, so these are three distinct. The word parts is not a good word. You can say moments, parts, um, aspects, okay, of the soul. All right. So in studying the soul, you see the soul loves itself, and in looking at that soul's love of itself, we see three things: memory, intellect, and will. And so what Bonaventure is going to do in this step is to investigate those three things a little more closely and to see how it's in these three things that we are seeing the image of God, right? So the image of God, which is again the human being, and specifically the human mind, okay, is revealed in these three aspects, okay, of the soul. All right. Now, without going into much detail, but in memory and intellect, what we are seeing is, so let me put this here, memory and intellect. We see the fact that for these things to operate, memory and intellect, they depend very much on something that they do not receive from anywhere else, right? So in their operation, we see that they depend on abilities and things that must come from somewhere else, right? So here in this case, of course, the implication is God, right? But the discussion is somewhat complicated about memory and intellect. I think I'll just start with intellect, and because that's a quicker discussion. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, in the intellect, you have in the operation of the intellect, right? So maybe I should put that here. So in the operation of the intellect, you see an ability. There's what we tend to call divine illumination, right? The fact that it's almost as though God is there shining a light for us, enabling us to see, right? And so we realize that there is an aspect of our intellectual operations um, that we don't drive, that something else is making it possible for us to be able to know anything at all, right? And it's this divine illumination, which he'll identify later as being, right? But this divine illumination comes from God, basically, right? So in every operation of our intellect, God is present, right? But that's not obvious to us, right? So I gave the example in a prior lecture that we see because of light, okay, but we don't see light, right? So that's the same thing, is that Now, intellect operates because of God, but we don't necessarily see God. We have to actually pay attention and reflect very carefully, and then we'll see God's presence just in the operations of our intellect. So that's one way in which we begin to see how God is present in the mind. Memory is slightly more complicated, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on memory. But one thing memory is in memory we see an image of eternity, right? So the fact that you have um, so a present that extends backwards and forwards, right? That means if you think of you right now, you think of your present moment, right? So think of it, your past no longer exists. It's gone, right? Right? All that exists is this present. But your memory is what extends, it takes the present and extends your present time backwards and forwards, right? Um, and so in some way that mirrors the idea of eternity. Eternity is this present that endures, that sort of extends in all directions, but it is the present. It's not, a successive series of moments. It's like this very ever deepening present that extends in all directions, so to speak. So the memory in some way reflects that, right? So let me just say this: memory reflects and teaches us about eternity. And so when we reflect on memory, we're learning about eternity and God. Then also we see in the idea of memory that memory depends on just a lot of things that obviously we don't get from other places, right? So if you think about the fact that you're looking at a computer or you're listening to language or you're looking at a cup or a pencil, um, the fact that you can identify these things or you can listen to something and know what's going on is that your memory is at work, right? So if you think about it, when you hold up a pencil, you're getting a sensation and you're seeing, you're getting all this visual input. But it is your history up until that point that's helping you categorize and tell you exactly what it is, right? So that's your memory at work. Your memory helps you constitute the present. It makes the present real to you. Okay, so it's a complicated concept, but that's what Bonaventure is referring to. So he says memory is something that reveals God to us. Now, the other operation of this, the soul, one of the three distinct things, is the operation of the will, and the will in theology is very often um, associated with love. And when you think about love, you think about what's good, right? So we love what is we consider to be good. Okay, and so in studying the human will, that's the human choices that we make and the desire for good, and also in just when we state things, right? He talks about what he calls judgments, and this is not like a judgment in a court of law. It's just simply making a statement about the world. So if I say that's a tree, that's a judgment, right? I've made a statement about the world. I've identified something. It says in doing that, we are actually doing something pretty interesting. We're making some choices about things. We're sort of revealing something about the world, right? And you reflect on that and begin to see um, that there's a desire for. We have a fundamental desire for truth, right? So if you think about it, right, human beings are just wired to tell for truth. Like you can say, yeah, you lie from time to time. Yeah, that's true. Um, but ultimately, we're simply wired for truth. So if you're walking towards a building, you don't just walk right into the wall, right? Because you recognize you can't walk through walls, right? So you tell the truth to yourself. Now, you may lie to someone else, but the thing is, we just fundamentally do not lie to ourselves, right? And so, and when we reflect on all these things, we begin to learn more about the world, and we're making certain judgments, and there are all these assumptions that we don't really see in choices that we make. And These things tell us about God. So this is what Bonaventure is doing in step three. He's reflecting on the human mind, which is the image of God, and he's saying the most fundamental thing about the mind is that it loves itself. And when you look at the soul's love for itself, we see three things. We see memory, intellect, and will. And these are three distinct sort of aspects of the soul. And he's saying when you look into memory and intellect and their operation and also the will, you see these abilities and all these ideas and things that have to come from somewhere else, not us. Okay, and that obviously is God. So it's similar to the discussion of the vestiges. The vestiges are signposts, but in this case now we're looking at the image, not just simply a signpost. Okay, so it's like um, I could look at the shadow, right? So steps one and two are like looking at shadows, right? There's only so much you can tell from looking at shadow, and shadows are distorted, notoriously unreliable for telling the truth. Okay, but if you look at step three is more like looking at a mirror, a reflection in a mirror. Now you can tell a lot more in a mirror, in a mirror. I mean gives you far more detail. Now, or let's say even a picture, right? We can think of that. If someone showed you a picture of someone else, there's a lot more you learn from a picture, right? Now you may not know what the person's like, the character, the sound of their voice, how they walk, how tall they are, but it tells us it's a whole step up, right? Than simply looking at shadows. Okay, so that is step three. Okay, and so I'll just read a quote from step three. It says, "See therefore how close the soul is to God, and how through their activity, um, memory leads us to eternity, intelligence to truth, and the elective faculty. So that's the will to the highest good." Okay, so he says that memory. Okay, so it teaches us about eternity, and then the intellect teaches us about truth. Okay, and the will um, teaches us about the good. Now, all these things are intertwined. All right, and when you read the chapter in more detail, you see a lot of these things linked together. But essentially, main point is that you look at the image of God in the mind, um, and it's pointing beyond itself to God. Now, I'm going to say something about step four. Step four, I don't have too much I want to add here. Now, it's an important step, um, but I'll keep it short. So, step four is called the consideration of God in His image, reformed through the gifts of grace. So, if you think of step three as think of it as an old painting. So, let's just say step three is an old, let's say, 300-year-old painting. Right? So you examine this painting, you see it's beautiful, you see all the colors, you see what the artist intended, you can see the eyes of the different characters in the painting, you can tell the story of what's going on. So you can get a lot from looking at a painting, right? Um, so the painting is reflecting the intention of the artist. So let's think of that as step three. Now, step four would be if someone decides, you know what, after doing a lot of study and says, you know what, this painting is great, but I think the artist actually did a few things that we no longer see because of the age of the painting, right? And so you have an artist or an expert who goes and restores the painting, right? So they make the colors the way they think the artist intended for the colors to be, and they clear up a lot of things, remove the grime and different sorts of things. And now you look at the painting and say, wow, that says even more. Okay, that's what step four is. So in step three, we're looking at the fact that human beings are made in the image of God. But step 4 brings up the idea of what's called original sin. So, original sin is the idea in Catholic uh, theology that the sin of the first humans in some way affected all humans. So original sin affected all humans and deformed the image of God. Oops. In all humans. So all human beings have the image of God. It's just deformed and distorted. Okay. And so what's required is a restoration. Okay. And in Christianity, and that's through Jesus Christ, who restores our souls by grace. Right? So in this case now, Christ comes and gives us gifts of grace. And now, so we go from being simply, a beautiful painting to something that's restored to its original intent, original form. And now that becomes a better image to then work with. Okay, so in step 3, you get to see a lot about God just by reflecting on and considering the human mind. But step 4 is where you actually get to actually see what God intended, right? And see what the image of God really is like. Okay, so we see what God intended, right? And we get the fuller sense of the image of God in step 4. And one final point about step 4 is here we recover our spiritual senses. Okay? And then, we're now going to be able to see God as God is through our proper spiritual senses.